Greetings, world, and welcome back to another episode of the NeuroWellness Project, a podcast devoted to exploring compassionate and evidence informed approaches to autism. The U.S. spends an estimated $420 million a year researching autism, with most of that funding for the past 20 years going towards genetic research. Yet, where has that gotten us so far? The rates are still rising. We have an aging population of people who are affected. We are still without any standardized mainstream treatment protocols. And it seems that we are no closer to finding the cause than we were before. As buzzwords like epigenetics and MTHFR enter the chat and become more common in the autism conversation, what do these terms really mean? And how do they fit into a more integrative, whole person approach to health? Today, I have the honor of being joined by Dr. Ari Calhoun, a naturopathic doctor who specializes in perinatal and pediatrics, translating cutting edge research into practical strategies for families navigating autism, ADHD, PANS and PANDAS, and more. Through her practice at Wholesome Brain Medicine in San Diego, Dr. Calhoun's work bridges genetics, environment, and empowerment. Dr. Calhoun is a recognized speaker and educator in the fields of neurodevelopment and functional medicine, and her approach reminds us that biology isn't fate. It is a conversation between our bodies and the world. And I am so excited to be joined now by Dr. Ari Calhoun. Hi, Dr. Ari. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us.
I'm so happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's just dive right in. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of background on you and what inspired you to focus on brain health and neurodevelopment.
Yeah. So, it wasn't necessarily a linear path. I think I've always had an interest somewhat in mental health. I grew up as a daughter of a psychologist, and so I was exposed at a very young age to just really the impact that mental health can have and how pervasive it is and the stigma that it has brought alongside of it. And yet, there are many of us who have struggled at one time or another with mental health challenges. And so I think I had an empathy towards those who were struggling with mental health and an awareness, I would say. But I didn't necessarily plan on going into that when I entered into naturopathic medical school. However, as luck would have it, I ended up in a clinic that had a particular focus on brain health. And I was mentored by a clinician who really spent a lot of time and kind of had a specialty for mental health. And at that time in that clinic, I was the only provider that saw pediatrics. And so I really started with kids that were struggling with behavioral disorders or anxiety. And, as you know, there's an overlap with other neurodevelopment disorders. And I would say, actually, I was quite intimidated by autism when I first started seeing clients with autism. And I felt that I really just didn't have enough information to be able to help these families in a meaningful way until, one case I did. And it wasn't that I knew everything. By all means, I had a lot to learn at that time, but really just implementing some of the foundations, we were able to see such huge improvements in this child. And not only with their behavior, but with their affection towards their parents and their siblings. And that was really just what kind of lit a fire underneath me and motivated me. And just, I just developed such a connection to these kids and these families, their story and their journey. And so just started to kind of like pick up more continuing education and more interest. And then finally, I had this intersection where I realized, like, I love this. Like, I love these kids. I love these families. And I know that for me to really give them the best health care, I have to be all in. And so it's not that I never see other disorders or, we still do some eczema and autoimmune, but my bread and butter and my focus is really on all things relating to the brain. So what impacts the brain trajectory in terms of neurodevelopment as well as mental health in the pediatric clientele. And I love it. It is so fulfilling. I cannot think of a better career path.
Wow. Thank you so much. So let's talk epigenetics if we can. A lot of people hear genetic predisposition and assume that that means like inevitability. right? So, could you explain to our listeners out there how epigenetics might influence whether certain predispositions actually manifest in somebody?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can kind of segue into this, but the epigenetic influence is in part going to depend on the genetic influences. So when we talk about genetics, it's quite a broad term, and there's different types of genetic influences and the level that that might impact someone's functioning or neurodevelopment trajectory. But in general, the term epigenetics means like on top of genetics. So it's how the environment and what we're exposed to on a day to day basis could influence gene expression. So we're born with a blueprint, we're born with our DNA, and that DNA is fixed and it doesn't change, but its function does change. So, we can turn on and off genes, we can silence them or kind of increase their functioning through our environment. And so that is really the layer of epigenetics. And we can see this transgenerational. So we have seen that kind of in generations past, if they've been exposed to a famine and starvation, that's going to influence the metabolism of their offspring down the line. If mothers are exposed to extreme amounts of stress in pregnancy, that's going to influence the stress of their offspring. So it can be like transgenerational or it can be in real time. And so we can see that our nutrition, our sleep, and our environment can influence kind of whether a gene is turned on and manifested more or if it's turned off. And really, that kind of that's for everybody. But when we talk about certain, genetic ailments or genetic impacts from a genetic mutation or a missing gene, the realm of epigenetic influence on a particular gene is going to really be dependent on what type of genetic influence we're talking about.
Wow. Thank you. So, when we're talking about autism and epigenetics, are there any specific gene variations that you have seen repeatedly in association with ASC presentations?
Sure. So when we talk about genetics as a whole, one of the things I think it's just, and this is why the conversation is so complex and dynamic, and there's so many different opinions. I mean, we've been studying autism and genetics for, yeah, I mean, ever, right? And there's
Yeah.
still not like a unified, just understanding of how genetics control for neurodevelopment trajectory. And this is because it's quite complicated and there's various layers to this. But I think the first thing to just understand is that when someone talks about genetics, there's kind of different meanings to that. So if you were to go to your pediatrician, your neurodevelopment pediatrician, your neurologist, what they'll oftentimes start with is something called a chromosomal microarray. And what those are looking for are deletions or duplications in a particular gene or set of genes. Okay. So if we have a particular deletion, then obviously we're not going to have a huge epigenetic influence because you can't influence a gene that's not there. Okay. And
Mhm.
these kind of deletions or duplications are going to contribute maybe to about 5 to 10% of children with autism. And so beyond that, then we might go on to exome sequencing or whole genome sequencing. And what those are looking for are rare variants, or those are looking for kind of like single mutations in a single gene that's going to have a more notable impact. But the gene is still present. Even with the copy number variants, you can see that there's a duplication. If it's a duplication in genetic material, you can still have influence from the environment because the gene is present, right? So if the gene is present, it'll be influenced by the environment. If the gene is not present, then we're not going to have an influence from the environment because the gene is not there. So it's going to be a lot more fixed. But these are going to have a stronger kind of outcome in terms of they're going to have a greater impact on individual functioning. These are typically seen as syndromic disorders. So we can talk about Rett syndrome or Fragile X syndrome or Kleefstra syndrome or Phelan-McDermid syndrome. So they're syndrome disorders. But even within those syndromes, and I have a lot of kids in my practice that have a syndrome, and yet their expression of that syndrome can be vastly different. And that's in big part because of our epigenetics. So how much of that gene is kind of turned on or turned off? And then also that one gene is just one part of their, thousands, tens of thousands of genes that influence neurodevelopment. So even if we're unable, if they're missing that gene and we can't, you know, impact that gene through epigenetics, we can still look at how could we support that pathway that is vulnerable, or how could we support these other pathways that are still maybe impacting the total trajectory. Okay, so those are kind of like the traditional genetics that people think about when you're going towards more of the traditional medicine realm. And then in the functional medicine realm, and this is where a lot of people in this kind of more wellness or alternative world are dealing with, what we look at are common variants. So these are things that are inherited from mom and dad, and they in themselves are not going to be causal for autism. And this is really about like 60% of what's contributing to autism risk are these common variants. And this is, we call them polygenomic because one gene on its own is not going to be really enough to kind of like tip the tables.
Yes.
And the influence is also dependent on an environmental trigger. Okay. And we can talk about like a number of those in terms of like what we see in office. But these are things where we look at them as a whole. So combinations of certain genetics are going to carry a higher risk. And then dependent on the genetic susceptibility, we have to have like there's a gene and environment influence that has to happen for that to really manifest in a meaningful way. And this is for all things in life. So I always say as like, and this was even before I got into genetics and started using it in my practice, we've all drawn a bad card. And that's not to be depressing or really down, but like we're all going to have different areas that we're going to struggle with. And so some families are going to struggle more with obesity and diabetes and metabolic disorders. And then some are going to be prone toward Alzheimer's. Others are going to be prone towards more addiction and mental health conditions. And so we all have like this individual set point that we're born with, and we have vulnerabilities in those pathways. And so what we can do with our genomics is understand, okay, what are those susceptibilities and how can I modify that outcome by understanding how to decrease that risk of gene expression or that risk of pressing on a really vulnerable pathway. So for those that, and this isn't even in the epigenetic realm, but those that struggle with risk for diabetes, well, they are going to have to manage their blood sugar and their carbohydrate intake and their sugar intake a lot more strictly than someone that doesn't have that genetic predisposition. But that doesn't mean that they're automatically going to develop diabetes. It just means that they're more prone to developing diabetes. And so this to me has been like so encouraging and hopeful. And it really helps us as parents like understand our kids in a deeper way and why they struggle with what they struggle with and why we have to work a little bit harder in this realm. And it feels more frustrating because it feels like we're doing all the things, but we have to put in that
Yeah.
extra layer of work or extra layer of support. But once we understand there's a reason, and there's a reason why they need that higher level of support there. What's cool is that there is a meaningful outcome. So there are ways that you can decrease that vulnerability and decrease that struggle by just understanding, recognizing, and supporting that kind of underlying susceptibility. But I think it's just important to recognize that genetics is a big field. And depending on who you're talking to, they might have the lens of looking at it from a common variant standpoint, or they might have the lens of looking at it from, okay, no, these are more significant missing genes or duplicated genes or mutated genes that are going to have a more fixed, but not totally fixed, but more fixed outcome.
Yes, cool. Thank you so much for that. So I know that one of the big like buzzwords out there, the hot topics is MTHFR and
Yeah.
methylation and gut brain. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about correlations between maternal methylation status and microbiome composition and the likelihood of developmental differences in our children.
Yeah. So, MTHFR that's one of the common variants. And that's something that a lot of people will bring up because we're most familiar with that one. And it certainly does have kind of global impacts. Okay. And it's interesting because in the epigenetic realm, this is one where the silencing of genes or the enhancement of genes is really governed by the process of methylation in these methyl groups. There's other aspects of epigenetics too, but this is a major one. So methylation in large part silences genes not for every instance, but the majority of them, it kind of like helps to turn them off a little bit. So this can be protective for genes that when they're gain of function genes, they're turned on and they're creating some level of dysfunction. By methylating, you can kind of turn it off. So methylation has a, epigenetic impact, but it also is important for other aspects too. So methylation is really important for myelination, which is the sheath, it's the covering of the nerves. Methylation is really important for neurotransmitter production, and that's going to impact our behavior and how we see the
Mhm.
world. And so methylation, what's interesting, so there's like two main MTHFR genes. The ones that's more highly associated with autism is the MTHFR C7T. And with just one copy, that's present in up to around like 45% of individuals. So again, we can see like that if we have one copy, not to say that it's not going to have some impact or we should ignore it, but it's not going to be the thing that we place our primary focus on unless there's other aspects of that pathway that are also impacted, right? So if someone also can't absorb B12 or they can't get adequate folate into their brain, or we have other methylation SNPs in that realm, then it might have a greater manifestation. Now, if they have two copies, that's going to, definitely increase that risk of it manifesting as a more meaningful trait. The night and we have identified that there's a greater odds of autism with an MTHFR mutation, specifically that C677T, but really those odds are quite small. So it's not even like the highest risk gene, but it doesn't mean that it's not worth exploring and we're supporting. But there are other things that, and this has, been fascinating to me to see because it was one that was highly emphasized. And it's one that many people come into my office asking for. And it's not that we want to dismiss it. It's just that if we get too fixated on that one gene, we're really missing so much more that could be even more meaningful for the particular child.
Yeah.
That said, supporting methylation, again, because it can help with the epigenetic regulation and it can have its own kind of impacts on other aspects of neurodevelopment, is certainly something that we know to be helpful. And, from an epigenetic standpoint, MTHFR is going to regulate methylation. And as I said, methylation impacts epigenetic
Mhm.
functioning. When we talk about epigenetics, I think why people just dance around it is because there's no true way to measure it. That's what's hard, right? So we can
Ooh.
see impacts. We kind of know what's happening, but there's no test that we can say, like, is this gene silenced or is it turned on? And what's going on if I kind of dial up methylation or dial it back? How is this in real time changing that gene expression? We know that it does change gene expression, but it's hard for us to explain kind of like that mechanism.
Yes.
So all that said, we do know methylation and epigenetics are a big factor in that prenatal time period. I think the prenatal time period, that's a particular area of focus that I have, and I am very interested in just better understanding what risk factors are we aware of and are modifiable during this time. And so I know you interviewed Dr. Fry. We know a ton about folate and the importance of folate during this time to modify brain development as well as potentially epigenetic signaling. And methylation is big. It's certainly something that is impacting DNA expression. And I think that where we are is we know it's important. We need to know more. We know
Yeah.
it's important. No more. We're off where we should be. Like we don't know as much as we would love to, we would hope to know, but we certainly know it does impact genetic expression through an epigenetic lens in the offspring.
Wow. Thank you so much. Yeah. And my son, I have a 7-year-old who is autistic, and he has two copies of that 677 and one
Okay.
copy of the 1298. But, we didn't know any of that going through prenatal and my pregnancies. 2020 hindsight, right? But yeah, it's been a whole journey, like kind of like diving down into this epigenetic wormhole to kind of like try to understand how to
Oh,
better support him.
100%.
Yeah.
Right, right, right. Yeah, no, I think, in those instances, it's a lot clearer in terms of like the need for the right form of folate and the
Mhm.
methylation support and how the environment can really influence the functioning of that gene. And it's certainly an important one. And again, the more you combine them together, so the more when you have two copies of the C677T and one of the other, that really has a much more profound impact than just one single SNP. So this is why it's helpful to look at genetics as a whole and look at the synergism between different SNPs, because we that's when we're starting to learn a lot more. And I think we're kind of going into that realm now. They're starting to learn, okay, if we two copies of this gene and two copies of this gene, then there's a significant increased risk in this pathway. But, SNPs in this gene and alone might not have as much of a notable impact. So this is constantly evolving and emerging field. But what's so great about this, and probably what you've realized with his own healing now, is that once having that information, it can really inform treatment.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally like life changing for not just for him, but for me too, as a parent. I was wondering if you could talk to us about any like emerging insights that are coming about like nutrient status and toxins or even like infections and how that might interact with this epigenetic vulnerability in neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yes, I think that there's two aspects of this. Many of these nutrients are going to impact the gene from an epigenetic standpoint, but they're also going to potentially support for instance, with MTHFR, with those mutations, you have a gene that's there and it's still functioning, but it's functioning at a reduced level. And so if
Mm,
you give it the cofactors, meaning like the nutrients that support its functioning, or if you bypass that mechanism where it is kind of stuck or rigid, then you will improve outcomes, right? Part of adding in methylation support, for instance, will have an epigenetic impact on that gene where it might make the gene a little bit more functional. But the other part of adding it in is that you're supporting the areas where it's weak. So you're bypassing like the weakened enzyme to give the body what it needs. Does that make sense? So the environment influences genes in two main ways. It can influence it through epigenetics, and we kind of understand some of those things. But what we really understand is when we identify a weakened pathway, we can figure out how to not push on that susceptibility, but rather support it from an
mm,
environmental or nutrient lens. And I can give you lots of different examples for that. So MTHFR is one. There's also, obviously with Dr. Fry's work, we've become very intimately aware of the importance of that folate receptor that takes folate receptor 1 that takes folate from the bloodstream into the brain. And
yes.
so as providers, we could look at antibodies. Does the child have an autoimmune response to that folate receptor? But we can also look at, does the child have any sort of genetic SNPs that impact that folate receptor's function? So the child could have negative antibodies, but they could have positive SNPs, meaning they've inherited the kind of bad copies of that particular receptor function. And so the receptor is functioning at a much lower level. And we know, especially with two copies, that can significantly increase that risk of autism and impair the body's ability to get folate within the brain. So what we can do is give that folinic acid, and that folinic acid isn't necessarily, well, there might be some epigenetic benefit to upregulating that receptor function, but more than that, what it's doing is it's taking an alternative receptor to get into the brain. So we're kind of like recognizing this is the limitation. Now, how do we kind of work around that? So that's kind of one nutrient example. From a toxin example, there is a gene called GCLC, and we've found that kids that have especially two copies of this gene have a higher risk of, or a higher odds of autism. And so, again, there's always this correlation causation, but those that have these two copies, higher odds of autism. And so the consideration here is that glutathione is our body's chief antioxidant. So it protects us from oxidative stress and is very important for phase 2 detox. So we need it for both protecting our body from toxins, but also getting rid of the toxins. So in knowing that, we might think about, okay, what can we do to minimize the toxic burden, right? Or what do we do to minimize the oxidative stress? So
Yes.
removing the potential exposures that would create a level of concern. In tandem, we could think about what can we do to upregulate the function of this enzyme or bypass this enzyme and give the child glutathione so they have adequate glutathione to decrease oxidative stress and support detoxification. Then when we come to infections, so one of my favorite SNPs, and I found this super, super fascinating, there's a test that I use that really has kind of taken the collection of the literature out there and figured out with these common variants, which have more kind of strong literature support for a increased risk of autism or higher odds of autism. And one of the ones that has the most significant impact is this gene that relates to increased production of this inflammatory molecule called interleukin 1 beta. So, backing up just a second, I'm very fascinated with like the immune brain connection. And this is one that we have, I feel, some of the strongest literature supporting. And so we have these cells within our brain, they're immune cells within our brain called the microglia. And the microglia are the early architects of the brain. So I always tell my patients we're born with like a very primitive roadway system. We're born with like dirt trails, dirt roads.
Yeah.
And over time, we have to take down all these dirt trails and we have
Uh-huh.
to build 5-lane interstates and we have to build tunnels and we have to build bridges and we have this huge infrastructure that we have to build. And the microglia are the architects. So they kind of coordinate which pathways do we need to take down, which pathways should we need to build up. Okay, that's a little
Mhm.
bit of a simplified version, but I think this helps to illustrate this. Now,
Sure.
these microglia, being that they are immune molecules, they are going to be sensitive to immune stimulation. So when the immune system gets upregulated, when our body releases cytokines, that can impact the function of the microglia. And there's a couple of really key cytokines that we know, okay, that really can activate the microglia or sensitize them. And when those microglia are activated or sensitized, there's lots of potentially like down the road happenings that could happen. But one of the things they do is they stop doing their job as well. And it can alter that trajectory of brain development. And so one of the cytokines that is known to activate the microglia is interleukin 1 beta. So if we have 2 copies of this particular variant that
Mhm.
will upregulate the release of interleukin 1 beta when the immune system gets stimulated, these individuals they're found to have an 8-fold higher odds of autism. Okay, which is pretty profound. And so we think about, okay, if I see a child that has these interleukin 1 beta SNPs, I know that that's their main common variant risk for autism. We can backtrack and think, well, what would stimulate the immune system? What happened? Did they have a regression? Did they have their behavior change after illness? Have you seen something that, there was some sort of change in their behavior or change in their development? And what we know is that many regressions are preceded by fevers, okay? Interleukin 1 beta is a primary cytokine that drives fever. Now, it's not the temperature, but I would say it's this association where interleukin 1 beta will drive fever, but what else does interleukin 1 beta do? It activates these microglia. So all that to say, we think about this as you have to have an immune trigger to release interleukin 1 beta. We're not just releasing it by happenstance, right? And
Yes.
then the positive, because we're not able to always avoid immune stimulation. It's just like we can't live in a bubble, right? So people that when I use kind of genetic counseling for those that are looking at, their babies and they're trying to understand, okay, what are their risk factors and how do I kind of support their development? They get really scared when this comes up because then they're going to, have a sense of panic or concern every illness that comes up. But the cool thing is
Mhm.
we have lots of things that can downregulate that interleukin 1 beta production. So we can use things like omegas, specialized pro-resolving mediators, which are kind of like fractionated fish oils, things like sulforaphane, and those are shown to decrease that interleukin 1 beta release. And so that's another way of kind of like protecting the brain in a way.
We know that children on the autism spectrum are usually a bit more like sensitive to their environments, right? And they require, yeah, like you were saying, it requires a little bit more effort in certain categories to support their health. So I was wondering if you could share with our listeners what are some like simple foundational ways that families can support healthy epigenetic expression like in their daily lives?
Yeah. No, it's such a good question and it is so important because we can get overwhelmed with the supplements or the
Yes.
newest medication on the block or the newest treatment, laser, but like the foundations are so key. And as a naturopathic doctor, we focus on this. And sometimes I'll say that I've even lost sight and I have to kind of rein myself in and like just remind myself the foundations are so important. I think the one of the major things that most people are focusing on, but also frustrated by, is diet. And so
Mhm.
diet is probably the most challenging thing for us to work on, but it has such a meaningful result. And one thing I'll tell parents is it doesn't it certainly is more challenging when you have a child on the spectrum. I want to recognize that. But even those that have neurotypical children struggle with this. And so
Mhm.
your child's not broken. Kids go through these picky phases. And we don't want that to discourage us. Like we
Yeah.
just have to keep putting our best effort forward and realize 9 things out of 10, or probably it's like 19 things out of 20 are going to fail. But that one thing that succeeds, we want to build on that. We want to celebrate that win. We want to just keep progressing forward. And I, as a parent, find this that I'm always in this kind of, I'll get into these modes where I'm really working on my kid's diet and I'm making these tremendous changes. And then I get tired and life comes up and I slip down and it's easy to feel discouraged. But what we don't want to do is just give up at that instance. We want to figure out, okay, how can we come back to this and how can we continue to put our best foot forward and try again? Because those are going to happen to everyone where we will give in. So diet is so foundational. And,
Mhm.
ultimately, the way that diet influences us is just so broad. It's giving us the foundational nutrients for our brain to work,
Mhm.
but also it's highly influential over our inflammatory signaling, and it's highly influential over our gut microbiome, which is, and has an extreme impact on our
Yes.
brain function. So diet, I always say we can make this really complicated and you can go through all the specialty diets, but the foundation is we need animal protein because that is
Yes.
going to supply our body the most key nutrients for methylation and mitochondrial function. So it is what is going to turn the battery on, turn the gas on, get things going in our brain. We also need our plants, and all of our plant-based fibers are going to support our microbiome and decrease that oxidative stress and inflammation. So what I tell my parents is focus on whichever one of those you want to first. Figure out how, if your child's not eating any meat, what can I add? What could they eat? Could they eat eggs? Could I make the eggs inside a higher egg crepes instead of, a one egg pancake? Can I try to get more of those in any way I can? Can I change it from they won't eat chicken, they won't eat steak? Will they eat a chicken nugget? Will they eat a meatball? Can we figure out a way to get those key nutrients in? So that's a big thing. And then the microbiome or the plant-based fibers, can I hide it? Can I change the format of it? Can I create some level of curiosity within them that makes them want to engage in food in a new way? And so there's a lot of different strategies that we can take to get a child to expand their diet. But I always say it is hard. And so going into this knowing that if it feels like a struggle, you're not alone. And it's not a reason to feel discouraged about it because that's just the nature of expanding our kids' diet. But you will find something that will work for them. And once you do and you get that leg up, you'll find things that you can grow. So obviously diet. I think
Yes.
there's also very other things in terms of just recognizing what's creating stress in their life. And especially in today's world, I live in San Diego and it's a busy city. And the culture is very much how can we optimize our child? And
Yeah.
so it feels almost you're falling behind if your kid isn't in 3 extracurricular activities and going and getting tutoring and they have this therapy. But really, honestly, sometimes less is more. And sometimes what we realize is overcrowding our kids' schedule is just creating too much stress. Too many things at home, too many toys, too many options, too many activities. I found a lot of my parents are like, we just have to stop. We have to stop BBA. We have to stop speech therapy. We have to take them out of these things because what we realize is they're creating a panic. They're breaking down in the car on the way. And so I just kind of encourage parents to sometimes take a break. And that might even be taking a break from supplements. Just taking a break. If it's becoming a stressor, that is no good epigenetic imprint. We don't want them to be stressed by their supplements. And so take a break from things for a while and give just do what we can to support their nervous system. And then
Yes.
finally, sleep. Sleep is something, it's our way of resetting our brain. It's a recalibration. It's when we detox things out of our brain. It's what, helps with hormone, like that circadian rhythm impacts all of our hormones. And so emphasize this is something that comes up a lot in this population because there's a number of things that are going to prohibit sleep. But a lot of times, parents are eager. I want the B12 injections. I want the
Right.
glucocorn. I want the mitochondria. And sometimes we just say, we have to hold off for a second until we can get them sleeping. And once we
Yes.
can get them sleeping, we can start to ramp things up. They need to sleep. That's the most important thing first. And so I think those foundations for all of us, not just our children, we can't be lost in the mix.
Wow. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Actually resonates pretty deeply with what we're doing over here. So we moved 4 years ago. I pulled my son out of public preschool and we've just been homeschooling, right? And when you have that kind of, you can create that ease in their daily life. Let's say he stays up really late because we know that sleep is a struggle for all of us, but especially when you're more sensitive, sleep might be a struggle. So, he just kind of has that freedom to sleep in until his body wakes him up. And I don't overload his schedule anymore with like ABA, OT, PT, extracurricular, co op, this, that, because yeah, I
Yeah.
just felt like it was a little bit like too much. And you worry though, as a parent, when you make that step to say, you know what, we're good on the speech for now, or like we're not going to be doing the OT route. You worry that you're doing something wrong, or you're like, doing a disservice to your child by not kind of like locking them into these systems. So yeah, I really appreciate that insight so much, because I have the same worry that anybody would, I think, in that situation. So
Lee.
my next question to you would be, what misconceptions about genetics and autism would you love to see corrected in the mainstream opinions?
Of course, that there's this genetics are the sole contributing factor and that they're fixed. And so, as I mentioned, even if we have a copy number variant or we have a syndromic disorder, those kids can improve. We cannot see them by that genetic variant alone. They have so much potential that is unrealized if we attribute all of the symptoms to that particular genetic mutation. Furthermore, many kids don't have any sort of strong genetic contributing factor on its own. It's more of these common variants that are highly influenced by their environment. And so the biggest thing that, I wish that would change is us recognizing this gene environment interaction. And this is what's going to make research so incredibly difficult. Obviously, we know that, and we've heard it a billion times, if you meet one child with autism, you've met one child with autism.
Yeah.
This is such a broad spectrum. So I actually like the label in general. I think there's lots of, issues that I could take up with just that alone. We don't want to label our children. We want to see in our children as individuals, what are they struggling with? What's impacting their quality of life? What is their individual potential? Where are their unique vulnerabilities? And how can we support them reach that? And so, yeah, I think we don't give them enough credit. There is just so much that they have ahead of them. They just might need a little bit extra support. And so our goal is to identify, where are those vulnerabilities and how can we give them that support? From a research standpoint, I think, again, going back to that, why is this challenging? It's because not everyone has that same susceptibility. So whether that be a particular toxin or a particular nutrient deficit or a particular stress environment, that might be a susceptibility for one child, but not another, based on their genetic makeup and how they're able to accommodate for that particular toxic exposure or accommodate for that particular nutrient deficit. So as you mentioned with your own case, taking folic acid and maybe being, undermethylated might not be an issue for one family, but might have been a huge part of your journey. And that's individual to your child. And so when we do these sweeping studies, what I really hope is that we learn how to combine the genetic predisposition alongside of the environmental exposure. And then we're able to really understand, oh, this is actually a huge contributing factor in this particular population. As a whole, it gets muted, but we really need to kind of look at that. This is even, and I'm just going to go on one further tangent. The sibling studies. Sibling studies are trying to kind of identify, okay, these are those with a particular genetic susceptibility, and then they have this particular environmental exposure, and let's look at the outcome. Unfortunately, even within, sibling studies, we are going to find two siblings that are very different. Sometimes we have siblings that are almost like identical copies of each
Yeah.
other genetically. And then I've seen in my own practice, when I'll do genomics of two siblings, they could present very differently. And this is why you can have two kids in your own family and they have, different struggles and different temperaments, different personalities. And so really, I think we have to kind of go even a step further and look at, and we could talk about a number of I'll just give one example. One example is, we know that this gene called PON is a gene that has been associated with higher odds of autism. If you have SNPs in this area, higher odds of autism. PON1 regulates organophosphate pesticide metabolism, and so detoxification. So organophosphate pesticides are what are the pesticides that are used on the majority of our crops. Okay. And so what we've found, and these are kind of like different studies, but those women that are in pregnancy that live closer to agricultural fields and really even within like a mile radius, so not like right next to it, but within a mile radius, have a higher odds of having children with autism. Now, if you were in that radius and then you also had a PON1 SNP, that's something that's going to be really pertinent for that particular family. If you didn't have that PON1 SNP, then maybe that exposure is going to be less relevant for you. And so, what we don't want to do is continue to dismiss these environmental influences because they're not a risk factor for everybody. We are all different. And so, this is why. Again, going back to every single illness out there, some people can eat eggs and bacon and ketogenic diet and never develop any sort of cholesterol issues. Other people, they're going to have cholesterol like through the roof. And so the way that our body takes in input from the environment is individual. And the more that we can get to that and recognize that this is fluid, this is dynamic, is, I think, where we're going to start to really make progress.
Wow. Thank you so much. So I guess that's a perfect segue for my next question. Could you tell us a little bit about your own practice and approach at Wholesome Brain Medicine?
So we follow, what is kind of termed as a biomedical approach towards neurodevelopment and mental wellness in pediatrics, that kind of really looking at these foundational aspects of what impacts our mental emotional state, what impacts our trajectory of neurodevelopment. So I kind of like to break this down into four main areas. And of course, there's kind of subcategories within that, but what's impacting the immune system? And that could be gut microbiome, that could be some aspects of immune stimulation, infections, toxins, even. What's impacting the mitochondria? We know that that's the energy production for our brain in that early development time period. 50% of the energy that we create goes towards our brain, which is incredible. We look at neurotransmitters, and I think that this is something where there's, again, been a lot of stigma, but there shouldn't be. And so neurotransmitters really do govern our behavior and how we perceive this world. And we're all born at different set points, and we then have different environmental influence that. And to make changes in this realm doesn't mean that we have to use a psych med, although sometimes it is relevant. But there's lots of things that we can do that are more natural, that are herbal, that are nutrient based, that can alter that neurotransmitter function and give us a much better quality of life and really change our symptoms. So, change behavior, but also change some things that may be more characteristic of some of the things we see in autism. So glutamate is a really big example there, where glutamate is going to contribute to the cognitive rigidity. It might contribute to the stereotypic behavior. It can contribute to sleep disruption. And it's also neurotoxic to the brain. So it's not just that, oh yeah, we want all of these improvements within the behavioral instance. We also don't want a lot of glutamate because it's damaging the brain when there's too high glutamate. So this is things that, when we identify what we can do from a neurotransmitter standpoint, there's a ton of benefits. And even beyond that, there's downstream effects. Glutamate can impact the mitochondria. I could go on and on. So there's the inflammation, the mitochondrial function, the neurotransmitters, and then finally this aspect of methylation. And methylation is big because it is so broad and how it impacts the epigenetics. So it can kind of alter gene expression, helps with neurotransmitter production. So none of these are in isolation. They all have kind of crosstalk, and all of them have these kind of subcategories that are contributory. But those are, the kind of the framework that we use to really start to examine and kind of assess where someone's vulnerabilities might arise and where they might come from. And we'll use, like many of the practitioners in our field, a variety of different testing to further kind of look into some of our hypotheses and expectations to confirm that and refine treatment. And yes, genetics is a big thing that I'll use in my practice to give us that blueprint right from the start. What were those areas of key vulnerability from the start? And for many parents, there's this emotional response because they, again, finally understand that, okay, this wasn't all my fault, or this is why this is continuing to be a challenge here. And it is, just eye-opening reflection of now where we can go to really meet the needs of our child. So I've loved genetics. It's been really, incredible. And again, I look at a lot of common variants, but we'll take information from these single mutations and these syndrome disorders, and that'll also inform treatment. We will look at that and say, okay, this is the pathway that's impacted. Let's see how we can support it. through other we can't necessarily even fix the genes sometimes, but we can give the body support in an area where it's compromised a bit. And those single gene mutations impact those same areas. Okay? So they're going to impact mitochondrial function. There and what do you do? What do you do? You give them mitochondrial support. And so it's really incredible. You should have Dr. Richard Bowles on your podcast. He is
Ooh.
certainly someone I look up to and is a geneticist and a leader in this field. But he will find that many of these kids with more notable gene variants have a significant response to supplementation or key medications that can be added to kind of alter that pathway that's impacted and have these really incredible notable outcomes. So the conversation, I guess, just doesn't end at genetics. There's so much more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for our listeners out there who might want to learn more about you or connect with you, what is the best way to get in touch?
Yeah. So our my practice is called Wholesome Brain Medicine. So wholesomebrainmedicine.com is where you can find a little bit more about our practice. And there's various ways to contact the clinic through that route. I'm also on Instagram a bit. I haven't been as active on there as much lately, just life and patience, but my handle is dr.Ari Calhoun. So Dr. Calhoun, and you can reach out there as well.
Oh, perfect. Dr. Ari, thank you so much. This has been phenomenal. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit down and have a chat.
Yeah, it was so good to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. And thank you so much to all of our listeners. We will catch you in the next episode.